In Genesis 22, God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. The passage is arguably the darkest and most pivotal moment in the book of Genesis. It's a moment where God's goodness could easily be questioned not only by Abraham, but by us as well. Atheist Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, says this about the binding of Isaac. By the standards of modern morality, this disgraceful story is an example simultaneously of child abuse, bullying into asymmetrical power relationships, and the first recorded use of the Nuremberg defense. I was only obeying orders. Critics like Dawkins read Genesis 22 through a modern moral lens, but they often miss the historical and covenantal context. In Abraham's world, promises from the divine and human sacrifice were understood very differently. The story deliberately shows that God is faithful, merciful, and unlike the gods of surrounding nations. He tests Abraham, but never abandons his covenant or demands what is ultimately wrong. So is what happens in Genesis 22 truly evil? I don't believe it is. In fact, what I'm about to show you may completely change how you view this story, and maybe even how you see God. By the end, you'll see how this difficult passage reveals God's goodness, provision, and grace in ways most people miss. And if you're feeling God calling you to give up something important, even something good, later in this video I'll share what I do before making that decision. So stay tuned, and welcome to Faith with Mitch. Hi guys, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to examine God's command to sacrifice Isaac within the broader context of Genesis and the ancient Near East. We'll then look at what transpires in the passage and ultimately reflect on its connection to Jesus and its relevance for our lives today. But before we get started, if you're tired of shallow answers and want thoughtful, Christ-centered conversations about Scripture, especially the hard parts, I'd encourage you to hit subscribe. Now let's dive in. We get introduced to Abram, later Abraham, in Genesis chapter 12. By this point in Genesis, we've learned that God created the cosmos and that he created humanity in his image to multiply, cultivate the earth, and subdue it. But starting with Adam and Eve, sin enters the world and fractures humanity's relationship with God, with each other, and with creation itself. This is evident in Cain killing Abel, the nations building the Tower of Babel, and of course, the flood. But God promises deliverance as early as Genesis chapter 3. And as we'll see, Abraham will play a central role in God's plan of redemption. In Genesis 12, God calls Abraham and promises him personal blessing and protection, a great name, numerous offspring that will become a great nation, land that he himself will be a blessing, and most importantly, God promises that through him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. These promises shape the entire storyline of Scripture, and they become even more concrete in Genesis 15, when God formally makes a covenant with Abraham. In the ancient Near East, when two parties made a covenant, they would cut animals in half, and both parties would walk between the pieces. This acted like a self-curse. It was as if they were saying, "May what happened to these animals happen to me if I break this covenant." But in this ceremony, the smoking pot and flaming torch, symbols of God's presence, passed through the pieces without Abraham, as he had fallen asleep. Thus God was conveying to Abraham that he alone would uphold the covenant. Yet Abraham's story shows the tension between trusting God and waiting on his timing. His journeys, his separation from Lot, and even having a child through Hagar reveal moments of struggle and potential doubt. Not disbelief, but a human wrestling with God's promises. That's why Genesis 17 is so important. God affirms that Abraham will indeed have a son with Sarah, not by Abraham's own initiative, but through God's supernatural promise. And in Genesis 21, after decades of waiting, Isaac is finally born, the long-promised heir, the miracle child, and the one through whom God's covenant will continue has arrived. Now imagine being Abraham when he hears this in Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Given the context, I hope we all can appreciate the emotional weight of God's command to sacrifice Isaac. Isaac is not simply Abraham's son. He's living proof of God's faithfulness, and God is asking Abraham to sacrifice him. If you're Abraham, you may be thinking this contradicts everything God promised you because fulfillment of the covenant promises seems to depend on Isaac and his ability to also produce an heir. You may be tempted to cite all the things you've given up for God or highlight how much you love your son Isaac. Or perhaps you're thinking about excuses, trying to justify why God should not be calling you to do this. But if you were living in the ancient Near East, you'd probably think that a God calling you to engage in human sacrifice was normal. For example, Leviticus 18, verse 21, assumes this to be a cultic practice of the Canaanites. As Old Testament scholar John Walton points out, in the ancient world, the devotion of a person was measured by what they were willing to give up. To Abraham's neighbors, sacrificing a child wasn't seen as an act of hate, but as the ultimate best-case demonstration of piety. By asking for Isaac, God was meeting Abraham in his own cultural context to ask if he was truly Abraham's highest priority. Now, thankfully, none of us will be asked to literally sacrifice our children, but we are all asked to give up our identities that are not rooted in God, those things we rely on for ultimate security or purpose apart from Him. This kind of tension between trusting God and responding to what God asks of us still happens today. A close friend of mine experienced something similar. He loved serving as an Army officer and believed God had called him to do so. But over time, he sensed God leading him out of the military and into seminary instead. It didn't make sense to him at first, and it certainly wasn't easy, but he chose to trust God over his own plans. Abraham is doing the same thing in Genesis 22, trusting God and obeying even when he couldn't see how God's promise and God's command could possibly fit together. We can only imagine what he might have been thinking as he traveled to the land of Moriah with Isaac for the offering, but if the text is any indication, he seems to have had faith in God to provide a substitute for Isaac. As they're traveling, Isaac perceptively asks in verse 7, "My father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And in verse 8, Abraham unexpectedly replies, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." It's as if Abraham knew two things that seemingly contradicted each other. He knew God was commanding him to sacrifice Isaac, but he also knew God was faithful and would fulfill his covenant obligations. Thus, Abraham pressed on to carry out God's command, but believed God would eventually provide a substitute for Isaac. But notice that his trust in God to provide a substitute was an act of faith, which the book of Hebrews in the New Testament later celebrates. So, how does this passage unexpectedly point to God's goodness, provision, and grace? First, God spares Isaac by providing a ram for Abraham to sacrifice instead of his son. God showed Abraham and Isaac that he wasn't like the other so-called gods. By providing a ram in place of Isaac, God demonstrated his provision and foreshadowed the ultimate sacrifice of Christ. According to tradition, the mountain that God spared Isaac is the same mountain that God did not spare his only begotten son. Now that is a tradition, but even if that's not historically accurate, Genesis 22 still powerfully foreshadows Christ carrying his own cross to Mount Calvary to die in our place. Second, the story demonstrates God's grace in teaching Abraham and Isaac that the covenant ultimately depends on God, not on Isaac or human effort. We've already seen Abraham try to fulfill God's promises on his own and fail, so this moment tests the object of his trust. Will he rely on himself or even on Isaac, or will he trust God alone? Abraham's obedience reveals his faith in God and reinforces that the covenant will be fulfilled by God's faithfulness, not human initiative. While it is tempting to look at this passage and question God's goodness or even Abraham's obedience to what God had called him to do, I think we need some humility to recognize that the order to sacrifice Isaac came from a good, gracious, and holy God. In the God delusion, Dawkins seems to judge God as if he were just another human. But as C.S. Lewis highlights in The Problem of Pain, the Creator holds a right over life that we do not. True humility is acknowledging this creator-creature distinction. Abraham didn't demand an explanation because he knew God and he trusted him. And as the book of Hebrews points out, he even believed God could raise Isaac from the dead. As for Abraham binding Isaac, I want to offer my own perspective as a father of two sons. Children seem to be born with a practically boundless capacity to trust their parents, and I've witnessed this in my own kids who have faith in me to feed, clothe, care, and love them. And practically anything I say, they often believe. As Abraham's son, Isaac likely had a high degree of trust in his father, perhaps even to the point of trusting him with his own life. I can imagine Isaac, as he was being bound by Abraham, recalling the words of his father, who said that the Lord would provide a substitute, calming his nerves and cultivating his trust both in his father and in the Lord. It's also worth noting that Abraham had grown old and that Isaac was possibly a young man by that time. Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice and was old enough to understand what was happening. Thus, Genesis 22 is not simply a story of a victim and a perpetrator. It's a story of mutual trust and sacrifice, with Isaac appearing as a willing participant. And the Lord did indeed provide a substitute, not just for Isaac, but for all of us. He fulfilled the covenant with Abraham and established a new one in the blood of Christ, inviting us all to participate in the blessings that come from a relationship with Jesus. In closing, if I were someone God was inviting or even commanding to give up something that is even a good thing, I'd personally consider doing at least 3 things before making a decision. First, I'd confirm what God is calling me to do through biblical discernment. Abraham had a relationship with the Lord, so if I were someone who wanted to discern God's calling, I'd focus on my relationship with Christ, read Scripture, pray, go to church, and seek spiritual guidance from my pastor and from Christian friends and mentors who know me best. Second, I try to discern why God might be inviting me to give up something. As we've learned from Genesis 22, even good things can undermine our trust or tempt us to trust in them rather than God. So giving up something good could actually be beneficial, especially if God is calling us to do it. Third and lastly, I'd seek to cultivate my trust in the Lord, reminding myself that God is faithful and that if He calls me to do something, He'll provide a way for me to do it. In other words, I'd remind myself that God will be present with me, enabling me to do what He's called me to do. And what better way to remind ourselves of God's faithfulness than to look to examples of it in Scripture and our own lives, recognizing that things don't always turn out the way we hope or expect, but that God has ultimately provided for us in the sacrifice of His Son. So, I want to hear from you. What is one Isaac in your life right now, one good thing that has become an ultimate thing that you feel God might be asking you to surrender? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this message. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, as I hope to catch you in the next episode. Thanks, and God bless.